To present the first speaker, Helen Murray van den Berg from the University of Leiden. Professor Murray van den Berg completed her PhD at Leiden University in 1995 and has been Professor of World Christianity at Leiden University since 2008. Her research focuses on Christianities of the Middle East, especially the Syriac-Assyrian traditions, and on the interactions between Western and Middle Eastern Christians after 1500. A book on the subject is currently forthcoming. It's entitled Scribes and Scriptures, The Church of the East in the Eastern Ottoman Provinces, 1500 to 1850. She's also engaged in a research project entitled Arabic and its Alternatives, and this deals with religious minorities in the formative years of the modern Middle East, 1920 to 50. As of June 2015, I guess congratulations are in order. She serves as director of the Institute of Eastern Christian Studies at Radboud University, Nijmegen. She will speak about writing the history of the Assyrians, heroism and persecution in Yaqub al-Malik Ismail's The Assyrians in the Two World Wars, Tehran, 1964.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and as I said yesterday, I thank the organizers for this wonderful occasion, which I think in itself, the occasion, will become part of the narrative about Seyfo. The fact that we are here with people from so many different groups and academic traditions really, I think, is an important step in discussing with each other what Seyfo means and how we are going to interpret that in the coming years. And my contribution to that will be a look at this discourse from a book that has been important in writing the history of the Assyrian part of this story, the book of Yaqub al-Malik, Assyrians in Two World Wars. I came across this book in 2000 when I visited Tehran. And there in the bookshop of the Assyrian Church of the East, they had a few books, and this book was among it. And on the one hand, that's not surprising because the book was printed in Tehran, but it was printed in '64, so you can imagine how long that book had been laying there. I hope they sold also copies, but there were still a few copies around there in Tehran. And at that point, I had heard about the book, but I'd never seen it, and I thought I'll just buy it and see what I can do with it. Well, for many years, I didn't have a chance to really get into it, but recently, in view of this research project, which was just mentioned, Arabic and its alternative, non-Muslim minorities and Arab nationalism, I saw a good occasion to get back to this volume, because it is a book that from an Assyrian perspective, tries to understand what happened with the Assyrians of Hakkari, Iran, and North Iraq in this period. Just a little bit more about this research project. What we are doing in this project is compare three different minority groups, I'll come back to that later, in the Middle East in the period 1920-1950. Minorities from the perspective of not being Arab. And they are the three groups that we are focusing on are the Jews of Baghdad, a very important group. As some of you will know, about 1/3 of Baghdad was Jewish in the 3040s. Then what we've called the Latin Christians of Palestine, especially of Jerusalem. And then the third group is the Syriac Christians, including all churches of the Syriac heritage of North Iraq. And these are three different groups that each have a kind of have various identities that may or may not be considered as non-Arab. So the Jews are going back and forth between Hebrew, Palestinian, Jewish, but also Arab identities. There's a kind of Arab nationalism in Iraq among Jews that was quite strong. The Palestinian Christians, you would think they would be safe and sound Arab, but they also have different loyalties. They look towards France for they write in French a lot. They are looking towards the West. They are not not such a logical part of Arab nationalism as you might think. And then the Syriac Christians, they also display a wide variety of choices as to where they are in this new Middle East and who are they going to put their bets on, where are they going. So we thought by comparing these three groups we can understand a little bit more what are the choices people made in this period and where are they going. Well, as some of you know, Tijmen Bada is here. He will also speak a little bit more about this Syriac aspect of it. My own research over the years have been mostly concerned with the Church of the East. And so I thought it's important for me to go back to this Church of the East history and see what happened in North Iraq and what's going on. So that was a good reason to also to go back to Yaqub al-Malik's book. I hinted already a little bit on these three bigger questions. So I'm not so much interested in the exact details of where Yaqub is confirming or contradicting other narratives. I might come to that in a later stage, but I'm also interested in the bigger issues that this book raises. And one is, I think, the whole issue of Assyrian Church of the East history writing. What is going on in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s? How are the Assyrians reflecting on what has happened in that period? And he is an important building stone in that story. Another big issue is, I think, how we have been touching on it over the last 1.5 days already. How are we going to connect all these different stories connected with Seyfo, genocide, Hakkari, Assyrians in Urmia, North Iraq? Are we going to connect it to one story or not? And how, if so, how are we going to do it? I'll come back to it towards the end of the presentation. And the third thing is, and that's something we have not discussed here, and maybe this is not the good place for it, but I think we should also think of how, and that's where the project I'm working on comes in, how this connects to the historiography of the Middle East. What is happening in the Middle East in this period? How is the Middle East in these new states that are being formed in the 20s, 30s, dealing with what happened with the Assyrians, with the Armenians, with all the other groups? And of course, all of you will be thinking of that. That, I think, is also important in understanding what is happening now in the Middle East. If we understand some of the mechanisms and how things worked in the 20s and 30s, I think it can help us to understand what is at stake at the moment in the Middle East. So these are the bigger issues. I'm not going to solve them today, but I just want you to know that these are the bigger things at stake, I think, even if you go to a relatively small book like that of Yaqub al-Malik. Some of you will be very familiar with this book, others won't, so I just mention a few things. The author, at least the author on the title page, is Yaqub al-Malik Ismail of Tiari Elaita, the Upper Tiari. Comes from a big family in Tiari. He was mentioned already several times during this conference. He was a military man. He served in the British levies after the World War, but of course he also served as a commander of the Assyrian troops during the war itself. As I just said, the book was published in Tehran, but most of his life he lived in Tel Tamr in Syria, and he died in Baghdad. And maybe that's a question of me to you. I'm not sure why it was published in Tehran. Maybe there's just a practical reason that it was possible to publish in Tehran much better than it was in Qamishli or in Khabur. That would be my initial feeling, but maybe some of you know why he... Afterwards, yeah, I'm happy to hear about it. So it was published in Tehran. What is also important is that it has some earlier layers in it which were produced by his brother. So his brother Shlimun apparently took notes during the war itself, and that was incorporated in the book. So far, it has been a little bit difficult for me to really establish which parts are Shlimun's and which parts are Yaqub's. Everywhere where there is a real Ana, it seems to be Yaqub. But I'm not quite sure, so I think I have to reread to really understand the various levels of the books. But just to, I treat it as Yaqub's story, because very obviously it's Yaqub who did the final redaction and really made the book to what it is. But maybe at some point the layers between the two brothers will become a little bit clearer. And there's another thing, I've used it as a background, and some of you know the importance of that. There are two important maps in the book that have been copied and used at various periods. And these maps in itself, I think, deserve further study. Where do they come from? How were they made? I mean, there is the author of the names of the maps is mentioned on the maps. David Jonan in 1960, but I'm not quite sure again what is the bigger context of that. just for those who have not read the book, the main issue of the book is a kind of a military history. That's the bulk of the book. It's a military history about all the battles that took place during the war, during 1914, mostly 15, 16, 17, 18. It goes on more or less year by year, month by month. What happened? What were the various positions of the armies? How did it develop? So that's really the bulk of the book. It is preceded by some introductory chapters, and notably that in these introductory chapters, that is the only place more or less where Assyrian means more than Church of the East, Hakkari, Ashirati. So in the rest of the book, when he talks about Assyrians, Atoraya, that's his term, it's clearly the tribal Assyrians from North Iraq. That is his main focus. But in the earlier chapters and a little bit at the end, it's wider than that. Also the maps are wider, and so then the history is including, of course, the ancient Assyrians, but also Abkar, the whole Ogar story of Nisibis and Edessa, etc. He's including in his narrative. So then he takes the story wider than just Hakkari. But that's in the introduction and a little bit at the end, not in the middle part of it. And then I think the very important issue that we have touched upon a little bit yesterday, and I think we should develop more, is that for him the war kind of just proceeds until Semele. And so the massacre of Semele in 1933 is kind of the logical outcome of what happens in the war. It's just a continuous story. There's no here's the war ending, and then you have a few years later you have Semele. No, it's a continuous story that just follows up until that particular event. Well, those of you who know something about the position of Yaku also know that this was very crucial. He was a crucial actor in this whole history. He was one of the leaders of the party that wanted more independence for the Assyrians, and with the Patriarch did not want to comply with the demands of the British and the Iraqis. So they were the group that in the end decided to go to France, to Syria. So he was definitely part of it, and so you have to say this book in a sense is also an apology for their particular position in that discussion. But it's also very clear that for him it's one continuous line. In this presentation, I would like to go back to his introduction to highlight a few kind of more general issues that he discusses in this book. And I think I'll just read a little bit of this introduction, which I've also put on the slide. And he writes in the introduction, "I thought I ought to finish this precious story of my brother Shlimon, which is about our Assyrian nation and people, especially for the benefit of young men and women and students and readers who wish to read stories about the past of our nation, to become familiar with the story of victories and heroism of their forefathers. Because of the calamities and troubles and persecutions and bloody fights and uncountable abuses, we keep and preserve our Assyrian identity and nationalism and language, and above all, our apostolic Orthodox Christian faith, the glory of the East." That's an important part of his introduction. And I want just to highlight a few elements of this part. First of all, apparently in the 60s and 70s in Iran, but also in Syria, I think there was a kind of, especially in Syria, but also in Iran, this need for telling the stories of the Assyrians. So apparently he felt there is a readership for these stories about what happened in Iraq. And what he then does is go back to this history. So what you see here, what I think many of us find so normal and so logical, but it is a choice to take this history of the war and of Semele as the building block for the identity and for educating your young readers. And that's a very important choice that he makes, and he's not the only one to make it, but he makes it very explicitly. What you also see that for him, geography, as exemplified by the maps, is very important in that. So he's always very clear about where everyone is going, which village here, where this battle, that battle. Geography is a very important part of that, which is also, on the one hand, logical, normal when you talk about nationalism, but it's important to note, so it's not a kind of abstract nationalism, it's about particular villages. Well, we've seen so many maps during this conference already. It's really part of the story. You have a map, you have a country, this is where we are, and he's very much part of that, and he contributes to that. It's interesting, he mentions language, but he doesn't really speak about language in the book. So far, I haven't come across any real discussion of the language issues. He mentions it in its introduction. The book is in Swadaya, in the modern vernacular language as it was developed in Iran and Iraq, but it's not, he doesn't speak about it. It's just, it's there, it is Swadaya, that's what you use, but there's no discussion about it. The only thing, and I'll come back to that also, is the Arabs are really the enemy. But he doesn't even discuss Arabic language or anything. He just mentions Arabs as, you know, the ones who are, you shouldn't talk about too much. That's more or less the way he deals with that. The second element, and there we come to one of the things we've been touching already again in the last days, the heroism. If there's any book you can think of that puts the Ashirati, the Assyrians from Hakkari as fighters, as military men, it's this book. It is really battle after battle, but most of these battles were victorious battles, and that is something we kind of forget. So the end of the story is negative, and the Assyrians lose Hakkari, but it's also clear that in the meantime, there were many battles that they won, at least in the presenting the way Yaku presents it. But I think he's fairly accurate there. He describes battles, and he says so many deaths on the side of the Turks, so many deaths on the side of the Christians, of the Assyrians, and most of the time the Assyrians come out victorious. So it's a really strange story. It's a very sad story that ends with the removal of the Assyrians from Hakkari, but if you look at the individual battles, it's really a story of brave fighting men that win all the battles and then go on to the next battle, etc. So it's a very mixed message he is giving to his readers in the young Assyrians, that we are not just a suffering people. That's also, he underlines the suffering, but it's also a kind of a fighter mentality that he transmits to his readers. And I think we were talking about it during one of the breaks. This book also would deserve a reading from someone in military history. I mean, I'm not at all at home in that, and I think it would really benefit from someone who's really at home in military history to kind of find out what's going on here between the lines. And then I think very important, his connection to the church. I already hinted at the fact that he was part of the pro-patriarchal party in the whole discussion in Iraq, and that's very clear throughout the whole book. So the support of the patriarchal family is really very basic in the way he presents history. And it's, well, I immediately jump to the patriarch. It's also the faith. I mean, it's also clear that for Yaku, it's not just a kind of attachment to a leader, it's also the faith itself that is important to him, that also comes through in the way he depicts things. But it's the faith, the church, and the church leaders. And for him, it's one line which you have, as an Assyrian, you have to just accept that and follow the leaders in that. And so he's very, very critical about everyone who criticizes the patriarch, or who criticizes Surma, or who criticizes anything that happens within the patriarchal family. And so he also takes a very clear position in the discussion, which already that shines through in the book, is going on in the war period about the secular powers of the patriarch. And he takes a very clear position. Yes, the patriarch is also our secular leader, and we should not do anything to jeopardize that. The patriarch is not just our spiritual leader, he's our secular leader too, and we have to support that. And he's very critical who do not support that. And then, of course, and that's something that needs to be said. He says it in the introduction. It's sad to say that some of them have become the cause of division and destruction of the unity of our Assyrian people for their personal gain. And there you see an ongoing theme, I think, in Assyrian historiography. This awareness, on the one hand, of these divisions, and the sense that something should be done about it, but at the same time, the story as it is very much the story of one group in the discussion. So how do you deal with that? So you see that time and again in these histories of the period, on the one hand, you describe the dissent, you describe the discussions, you describe the fights within the Assyrian community, and of course you want to overcome that. But how, that really is a very difficult thing to do. And then one more issue before I go to the conclusions. Very interesting if you try to read between the lines of who in the end is to blame according to Yaku of what's going on in the war. You see he mentions a couple of culprits, and he's not decisively pointing to one. He puts several people on the stage, or people or groups on the stage. And I think I will say a few words about Islam first, because we've also been talking about that already. He is a kind of, I wouldn't say nuanced about Islam, but he's very double about Islam. So on the one hand, he has a sentence, which I don't have here, which is very obvious, like the bloody sword, well, not a sword, but the bloody Islam, etc., that always has persecuted the Christians, etc. So that's kind of a familiar sentence that we've come across. But at the same time, he spends pages and pages in discussing how well Kurds and Assyrians lived together, and how well it worked in the mountains, and that you had this mutual understanding, and that there was no real problem there. He uses the word, the Barkia Muta, so the covenant between Assyrians and the Kurds, and that worked so well. And the fact that in the end, in the war, they were the ones doing the slaughtering really was not so much at their doing, but it happened mostly because of the other factors. I see I have to hurry up a little bit, so I'll try to skip a few things. The Kurds, so in a sense, are kind of, well, put outside the discussion. They are not the worst culprits, even though they are doing the actual killing. So the more important evildoers are the Turks, of course, that is understandable, and then the British. He's also in the tradition of the British betrayal, so the British really, and then in a sense the French, but they're not that important in this book. So it's mostly the Turks and the British that are most to be blamed for what happened to the Assyrians. To round up, if we try and see what Assyrian history writing is about, it's in fact too early to say, but there's a few things to mention. First, I think we should be, some people have been saying, not here, but in other places, that really the going back to history is a very recent affair. In a sense, it is that we are talking about it communally and discussing these discourses together. That is fairly recent. But if you look back, you see how Syrian Christians from all different groups and parties have been writing histories and memoirs, etc., from right after the war until today. So it's not something fairly recent. It has been going on for a long time. So it's only now that we start to combine them, but it is relatively recent. If we're gonna say something about it, so we have to take into account these various narratives and see where they were written. I think we have to really take into account who was writing what where, and if something's written for a Syrian public, for an Iranian public, we really have to take that into account. And then I think for Yaku it's very important, it's not just Assyrian history in a wider sense, but it's also Church of the East history. There is a lot in his book that discusses particular issues within the Church of the East that he tries to address, and that I think are still relevant in many ways. I already, second conclusion, refer to the Seyfo Semele issue. If we talk about genocide for the Hakkari Assyrians, I think Semele is more important than the war events in Hakkari, though that was expulsion, that was violent, but it was also a war context. Semele was a massacre that well, has everything that a genocide has. So that's another kind of issue that for the Assyrians is one continuous story, as it already has been referred to. And I think we have to try and see all these different events, on the one hand, in one story, but also be very aware of the difference of these different episodes. And there's one thing I think that we have to kind of keep in mind and what I'm not quite sure about is how all the Christians of Syriac heritage in that period already were aware of the connections between all these stories. I'm not so sure. I would be very interested in hearing from others here how the people in Anwardo or the people in Adiyaman or the people in Urmia were aware of the larger story. So far, I haven't seen signs of it. I think this is getting later, that people are aware that they were part of a much larger story, but I think we'll have to think about that. And then I think Iraq is very particular in its post-war history. So the nation building in Iraq had a particular context that we need to understand what happened to the Assyrians in Iraq in the 1920s and 30s. How Iraqi nationalism was in a sense dependent on scapegoating the Assyrians is something that in a sense has not so much to do with the Assyrians, but has to do with internal Iraqi politics that we also have to take into account. And that then will bring me to the last issue that I will think about in the coming years also, is what this tells us about minoritization of all these different groups within the Middle East. And I think the Assyrians are a very interesting example of seeing how very complex dynamics of internal Assyrian issues coming together with issues in other, with political issues, with transnational global issues, and lead to this particular outcome. And it's an intertwined history that we really have to think about more. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. There is doubtlessly much more to be said. We will have time more in the question and answer period. It's my pleasure now to proceed to our second speaker, Fadi Daoud, who recently completed his PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And in his PhD, he examined the Assyrian community in Iraq during the period of the British Mandate, resulting in the Semele massacre we just heard about over the period from 1920 to 1933. And since the fall of 2013, he is teaching at Lakehead University, Thunder Bay, Canada. The title of his talk is The Aftermath of a Genocide, Assyrians and the Baquba Refugee Camp, 1919 to 1923.
Thank you. As it was mentioned, this particular paper comes out of a dissertation that examines the history of the Syrian community in Iraq in the interwar period. And really, I'm interested, or in this paper I will present this sort of ideas of colonial discipline and coloniality that comes out of British perceptions and British ideas of the Syrian population that went to the refugee camp. This is not the only refugee camp in the period. There are a number of refugee camps that are set up in Iraq, but this is certainly the largest, and it contains individuals that came from the Haikari and Urmia regions, and for the most part they're Syrians that belong to the Chaldean Church, people like Agapotros, who I will mention here, and Church of the East, including Marshamoun and his family that were residents of the camp in the period. For the most part, at least in my research from what I see, and I'd love to hear more about this, those that came from Tur Abdin and other places, they didn't really go to Iraq, but for those, the small number that actually went to Iraq, they actually never ended up in this particular refugee camp or in the large encampments that the British set up. Due to the big, large church populations, they ended up in Mosul and the surrounding region. A little bit about the camp. In 1919-1920, about 40,000 Assyrians and Armenians arrived for settlement to the Baquba refugee camp in Iraq. The camp, located 40 kilometers north of Baghdad, in the small town, or as the British describe it, village, others would describe it as a town because there was a Musarrafiyya there, of Baquba. The Syrian population, refugee population at the time, was divided into two major groups, and I'm sure we know about those from the Haikari Mountains and those from Urmi. The Assyrians of the Haikari were divided into two subgroups, the Ashirats and the Ra'iyats. which totaled about 14,500 individuals. The term Ashirats, for those who don't know, denotes the semi-independent tribes of the Haikari Mountains, who until the First World War under Ottoman rule had lived in villages with very little interference from the local Kurdish chiefs or the Ottoman government. Ra'ayats were the Syrian tribes that lived in the Kurdish-controlled territories or areas and had to pay a tax to the Kurdish authorities who managed the villages on behalf of the Ottoman government. A total of 10,500 Urmiya Syrians also settled in the refugee camp. The Syrians of the Urmi region traditionally did not adhere to the tribal divisions of the Haikari Mountains, and they did not identify with their religious or the religious hierarchy per se. They actually politically identified with the Iranian state and the Iranian Empire of the time. And they actually also lived pretty well in their towns and villages with other ethnic and religious groups of the region. The Baquba refugee camp first became operational in November 1918, and the vast majority of the refugees arrived in the early months of 1919. Both British and League of Nations officials were mainly concerned with the Syrian population in Baquba as part of the force that had helped the British and French armies defeat the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. The first wave of refugees to settle in the camp were those who had reached Iraq as part of the Syrian military force or contingent that fought with the Russians and later British forces in the Haikari Mountains and western regions of Iran. In the camp, Haikari Syrians continued to be divided, and I think it was mentioned when Nicholas was talking, somebody actually asked this question, continued to be divided according to their quote-unquote traditional tribal affiliations under the leadership of the Marshamoon, and interestingly, a second type of leadership emerges, which is the military leader under the leadership of General Agha-Putras, the commanding officer of the Syrian forces during the First World War. Putras and his troops came to Baquba from the Hamadan province in Iran, where the Syrians forces had fought with British officers in the summer and autumn of 1918. Originally named the Jilu camp, refugee camp by the British at the conclusion of the First World War, the name of the camp was changed to Baquba in the early months of 1919 as the British realized not all these Assyrians actually belonged to this one tribe. Russian and Iranian troops also had referred to the Assyrians as Jidus during the war, and using the name of this one Assyrian tribe, the British concluded, well, they must all be of this particular tribal affiliation. The British military administration of Iraq, and by the way, I will have to say this, at that point, Iraq was not a mandate, it was under occupation by the British, and when the British were setting up the administration in Iraq, it was set up under the India Office. Interestingly speaking, the refugees were not administered under the India Office, they were administered separately under the Imperial War Office, and the idea was financial on one end. The population in the camp warranted huge sums of money to manage, and the British looked at the budget that would administer Iraq, and 50% of the budget would have cost to administer this one particular camp. So they kept them separate, and actually even the encampment was administered completely separately from the Iraqi state. The British military administration of the camp established the camp built around the left bank of the Diyala River. Its private and public buildings, at least, were constructed with brick and mud building materials that were easily obtainable from the area around the river. The areas that surrounded the Baquba town of Baquba was very fertile, with plentiful of fruit trees and vegetable gardens. And Baquba was a quiet place that had little contact with the urban center of Baghdad. And actually, if you know anything about, if we read Hana Batata, we see that the urban-rural divide in Iraq during the Ottoman Empire was very deep, where, he describes Baghdad sort of, hugely stricken with famine, people dying, and people in the rural areas and rural villages had food rotten in the granaries because people were, there weren't enough people to consume the food. So this is the sort of situation that the British came and arrived to in Iraq, and also these Assyrian refugees. Its inhabitants, Baquba's inhabitants, were largely affiliated with local tribes using the Uthmaniya Canal around the region, around the area, which fed the Diyala River and the plains next to the canal for watering and grazing of sheep and other livestock. Baquba's population relied heavily on the production of wool and dairy for their economic well-being. The British found this grazing area used by Baquba's inhabitants to be the most suitable for the construction of the refugee camp. And when they decided to occupy the area, they banned local Arab populations from using their traditional pastoral land, particularly around the Othmania Canal. Depriving the local population of vital grazing grounds left them disgruntled with both the British and the Syrian refugees that had arrived. As a result, the villagers became hostile, and from the early days after the establishment of the camp, Bedouin tribal sheiks organized regular attacks against the refugees in the camp. This hostility continued to threaten the population of the camp until the early days of 1927-28. The camp itself, as a colonial space, was divided into three sections, A, B, and C. Armenians were settled in Section A. The majority of Assyrians from the Haikari and a small number of Armenians were placed in Section B, and a mix of Assyrians from Urmia and a small number of Haikari Assyrians were placed in Section C. Each of these sections was administered by a senior British officer who was in charge of keeping its residents within confines of their respective area and oversaw their welfare, cleanliness, and discipline. In order to enforce order and security inside the camp, each officer was assisted by 5 non-commissioned soldiers, and by 1920, a total of 3,000 British and Indian troops were stationed in Baquba. The number of troops decreased rapidly as the mandate went on, following the summer of 1920, especially and after the declaration of the mandate began to take force. The military expenditures in Iraq were cut. Although effectively run as a military base, the camp was somewhat absurdly publicized by Iraq's military authorities and by camp's first commander, Austin, as a modern European city with hospitals, schools, sanitation facilities, and playgrounds for the refugee children. In reality, it was a military enclosure, whereas in other parts of the British Empire, the army was in charge of managing all aspects of the daily life of this population. Military officials also limited the movement of the refugees outside the camp, with the result that they had little or no contact with the outsiders, particularly the native population of the region. While the Syrians were perceived as weak and in need of protection, they were also thought to be potentially disruptive and prone to infighting. Restricting the movement of Assyrians and banning members of the community from interacting with members of other groups both conformed with and contravened colonial practices. While military enclosures were often used by the French in Algeria, for example, to isolate troublesome populations, in colonial cities such as Dar es Salaam in Africa, individuals were encouraged to participate fully in the social and economic life of the urban space and the urban community as part of an ideal, civilized, urban European space. But within the confines of a refugee camp in isolation from new civic order promoted by the British authorities in early Mandate Iraq, the Assyrians were restricted from doing so. In 1918, when the refugees began to arrive in Baquba, it was difficult to organize them in accordance with their traditional tribal backgrounds, as the officials were keen to do. The Armenians were assigned to Area A of the camp, and the Syrians, regardless of tribal affiliation or background, were settled in Area B and C. But soon after their arrival, the thousands of these individuals arrived, the British began to organize them in order to return them to their traditional way of living. The refugees also arrived with thousands of domestic animals, including ponies, mules, cattle, donkeys, camels, and sheep, which presented a very serious health hazard in the eyes of the British population because they were able to graze in pastures around the camp. The camp became even more crowded after the closure of a smaller refugee camp that housed about 1,000 people in Beladruz, about 48 kilometers east of Baquba, and as a result of friction, that camp was closed as a result of friction with local Arab populations in that region. In the autumn of 1919, colonial officials initiated a plan for the reorganization of the camp, as I said, along tribal lines, in order to enforce stricter surveillance and maintain public security. As noted by Stephen Legg, in the case of British India, colonial governments often experimented with the regulation and segregation of population in the name of political and social safety. The reorganization of the camp placed the Syrian tribal leaders in close contact with their followers, helping to reproduce the political structure that had organized them in the Haikari Mountains. From the beginning, Assyrians had been kept in separate from the Armenian population, and as the British believed that the antagonism between the two groups posed a security threat. In fact, social and cultural differences seem to have hindered the establishment of a positive living relationship between the two groups, the British thought, and British officials frequently reported that the men of the Assyrian Tiari tribe in particular were prone to bullying a smaller group of Armenians housed in the section next to them. The Tiari men, who were notorious according to British officers, they were notorious for their military prowess, conducting occasional attacks on the Armenian population in an effort to dominate the public space of the camp. The Assyrians of the Haikari, Shirats, were the largest population to settle in Baquba at the conclusion of the First World War, and they arrived in the camp with their tribal and religious leaders who continued to function as intermediaries. And if you read Mahmoud Mamdani's work, it's very similar to his ideas on colonial despotism, where you have local individuals working with the colonial government in order to speak for the population. And this really hindered the voices of the population actually reaching both the military and the colonial officials in Baghdad. In fact, during the first few months at Baquba, the Assyrians kept their traditional social and political structures intact, so the British thought. Their tribal chiefs continued to carry out administrative duties and retain considerable influence over the daily lives of the refugee population. Mar Polis Shamoun, the patriarch of the Church of the East, who also was a resident of the camp, continued to function as the political and religious head of the Assyrian Tribal Council, an organization that incorporated all of the community's tribal leaders. According to the British, under the watchful eye of the military regime, this council was kept operational in the period from 1919 to 1922. This is when, things start changing in Iraq as a result of the death of Mar Shamoun and the ascendance of a 12-year-old boy to the patriarchate. The British saw its members, this tribal council, as the natural leaders of the community and as a useful instrument for the control of the population, an attitude typical to colonial situations in India. The model was famously transplanted to the rural areas of colonial Iraq, which was perceived as places where tribes and tribal leaders had historically dominated the political landscape, and as pre-modern settings untainted by the negative and destabilizing efforts of capitalism. As a result, tribal chiefs were employed to control and manage rural districts on behalf of the colonial government, and if we know anything about Iraq, the organic laws in Iraq were used for this purpose. While the sheikhs were expected to rule in accordance with the British political expectations, the Arab sheikhs, the Assyrian leaders, including Mar Polis Shamoun, maintained an independent sphere of action according to the colonial establishment in the camp. While they were in the camp, the Assyrian leadership held regular weekly meetings in tent that the British had set up for the purpose. The tribal council, as it became known amongst British officials, was allowed to administer community affairs with little interference from British officials, partly as a result of lack of resources available to colonial administration in early days of the occupation, echoing its attitudes to tribal sheikhs elsewhere in Iraq. The British administration saw the authority of the Assyrians as legitimate, noble, and unaffected and uncorrupted by the colonial ideas taking hold over the urban populations in the country. The Mar of Shamoun officiated weekly religious services, as did leaders of the Armenian community in the camp. The Assyrians were also allowed to participate in religious ceremonies and social activities that they had traditionally conducted in their villages in the past. This allowed the community to function in accordance to what colonial officials believed to be the traditional communal life. The Assyrians from Urmia region held a singular place in British colonial imagination. They were thought to be more civilized due to their long history of contact with American and European missionary societies. A number of them who had been educated in the United States and spoke English were employed as translators and administrators inside the camp, but the British administration was concerned with their future in Iraq, as they believed that they would be unable to defend themselves in the event of attacks from the Arab population to the camp. Indicative of this attitude, in fact, is the fact that the Assyrians of Urmia were never classified as warriors by the British, unlike their Haikari counterparts. And we heard from Helene a bit about this warriorization. I actually take this up in my dissertation and I have a chapter on the militarization of the Syrian and this idea of warrior races. Those with professional training, particularly those that came from Oromia, became the first to leave the refugee camp during the late 1920s and early 1921, recruited by the colonial administration for service in Iraq. For instance, during the 1920s, some Oromia Syrians involved in the medical profession found employment in Iraq's Ministry of Health, and they were actually distributed throughout Iraq to practice as medical doctors. In fact, medical services were classified as the most important priority inside Baquba. Given their role in controlling the spread of disease and infection, medical doctors were much needed. Upon arrival, every refugee had to be examined and then quote-unquote disinfected. Special quarantine areas were set up in for each and every refugee had to go through a battery of medical tests to become eligible for residency. The use of modern medicine to govern and control native populations was a widespread colonial practice, as has been described by Megan Vaughan in the case of some African colonies, while in the cases Vaughan analyzes colonial officials had years to penetrate African societies and reshape ideas of sexuality, gender relations, and ideas of surrounding illness and cleanliness. In Baquba, colonial military officials developed medical standards based on what they believed would help civilize the Assyrians in the immediate future. As a colonial space, British officials, what they tried to do, each section of the camp had to be self-governed and separate. It had to have canteens for food preparation, and food preparation was actually changed this social dynamic within the community, because communal living and communal food preparation became an issue that colonial officials used in order to create less expensive food preparation techniques. This, with other sort of employment activities that the British created for the population, really eventually changed the tribal structure and the social structure of the Syrian community, leading to three types of leadership positions emerging or competing leadership interests: the military leaders, those who actually became participatories in the Iraq levies force, the religious leaders, the Marshall family, and the third is the educated intelligentsia who are promoting these ideas of nationalism that I think really did not penetrate the Syrian community until the Simele massacre of 1933, which actually culminated this relationship between the colonial administration, the Iraqis, and the Syrians. I can't, I'm out of time, to continue further into this, but eventually the Syrians were used more than just militarily. They were used for other purposes in Iraq, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Our last presenters are appearing in pair. First of the two is Miriam Georgis, a doctoral candidate in the Political Science Department at the University of Alberta. Her dissertation, Post-War Iraq, 2003 till 2014, a post-colonial grassroots approach to the crisis of democratic nation building, deals with the impact of the American-led invasion on domestic politics in the post-Saddam Iraq. She uses a post-colonial history from below framework for her analysis, and is also interested in nation building and Middle East politics with a focus on indigenous politics. She herself is an Assyrian and was raised on Anishinabek and Haudenosaunee territory, so I guess sensitive to same situations in other cultures. The second speaker, Riva Gevargis, has completed her master's degree in political science as well at McMaster University. Her master's thesis was entitled Nation Building in Iraq, the Assyrian Dilemma. She questions traditional international relations theories by analyzing the erasure of Iraq's indigenous minority, the Assyrians, following the 2003 invasion. She holds two earlier bachelors, one in philosophy and politics from New York University, and another one in education from the University of Ottawa. Together they will speak about unrecognized, the exclusion of the Assyrian identity in modern Iraq.
Thank you. It's always important to remember that all these spaces, or a lot of these spaces that we're talking about, were had different names and had different people living in them. So that's why I always mention that I was raised on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory in Ontario, Canada. So thank you to the organizing committee and the Inanna Foundation for having us here. It's an absolute pleasure to be at the Free University of Berlin and to participate in such an important discussion. Our talk is mainly concerned with the future of Assyrians in Iraq, or in the Middle East, specifically situating them as an indigenous minority. Beginning with Seyfo, the Assyrians have continuously undergone genocide, persecution, dispossession of their lands, and assimilation policies. We argue the Assyrians who came to settle in Iraq after the still unrecognized genocide of 1915 by the Young Turks must be contextualized. The borders between Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran were modern colonial constructions. So Assyrians traditionally inhabited these lands even after the fall of their empire. Following the First World War, Assyrians found themselves arbitrarily divided between 4 states. So those Assyrians who fled the genocide in present-day Turkey were arguably moving within their traditional territories because they would have seen this division of their population between 4 modern nation states as artificial. Our central argument is that an analysis of genocide must be understood as part and parcel of the nation-building project of modern states. You can really tell we're political scientists. This means that while an examination of Muslim-Christian relations can be fruitful, these for us are less meaningful without engaging the political factors involved, namely the politics of nation building and its exclusionary practices. Also, and perhaps more problematically, focusing only on religious relations has reduced us to a religious minority, effectively erasing our ethnic identity and, in turn, our ties to our ancestral homelands. In this way, a comparison between the Seyfo genocide of 1915 in the newly constructed Turkish state is analogous to the Semel massacre of 1933 in the newly constructed Iraqi state. However, these are not mere historical instances. Iraq underwent a nation-building project following the US-led invasion in 2003, which saw the exclusion and expulsion of its native inhabitants, the Assyrians, yet again. In this presentation, we specifically examine the political structure of Iraq by looking at the constitution adopted in 2005. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our theoretical framework because this will be important in situating the next section, which Riva will discuss. The erasure of Mesopotamia's indigenous inhabitants cannot be studied in isolation. Excuse me. Rather, it must be studied in conjunction with the modern phenomenon of nationalism and nation building that has necessitated the removal of those identified as outsiders or foreigners. In part, this is how sovereignty works, building one concrete nation inside because of chaos outside. This is also how nation building and nationalism works. The modern states of Turkey and Iraq were created to be homogeneous nation states, meaning those who did not identify as Turks or Arabs, respectively, could not be part of the nation. Patrick Wolf examines the relationship between genocide and the settler colonial tendency, which he calls the logic of elimination. Specifically, he links land with life, so contests for land can be, and indeed are often, contests for life. Similarly, Deborah Bird Rose reminds us that to get in the way of settler colonization, all the native has to do is stay home. So the main motive for elimination is not race or religion or ethnicity, but access to territory. Territoriality is settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element. While the settler colonialism of North America, New Zealand, Australia by Europeans is a specific experience, a number of scholars have examined the logic of erasing indigenous peoples and its extension to the logic of erasing or the oppression of other racialized peoples. Similarly, We are extending this understanding to the experiences of the conquest, colonization, dispossession, and the settlement of Assyrians' ancestral homelands in the Middle East. We argue there are similarities between these experiences, which will be fleshed out in the section to follow, but more importantly, that territoriality is a fundamental element to constructing the nation. Indigenous writers Patricia Montour and Patricia McGuire tell us, the land is who we are as peoples. To know who you are, you must also know where you come from. This means understanding the relationship you have with the territory of your people. So the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands has had a profound impact on their identity, especially in the world heralded by colonial modernity, where a nation needs a state to establish or maintain its identity. Moreover, this dispossession has also resulted in their social, political, and economic marginalization. This experience of identity as being attached to a land is also applicable to Assyrians. Along with other mechanisms of erasure, Assyrians' removal from their lands has had a profound impact on their social, cultural, political, and economic structure. Nations, of course, are not built on territory alone. States must engage in a process of nation building, including founding myths embedded within historical discourses. Isabel Altamirano argues that the nation requires a sense of sameness based on tradition when expressing itself through the language of nationalism, which of course was the atmosphere after World War I. Justifications are made for violence and assimilatory policies against the indigenous population, including the denigration of the culture of the other. We can see these processes taking shape as the Young Turks sought to construct a homogeneous Turkish nation. We also see these processes at work in the nascent Iraqi state, as the political elites, with the aid of the British, attempted to create a homogeneous Arab state. In both of these instances, violence against the other, in this case the Assyrians, was justified because this particular community was marked as the other. My colleague Riva will now apply our framework to the case of the Assyrians in both Turkey and Iraq.
A comparative analysis of the Seyfo genocide of 1915 and the Semele massacre of 1933 in Iraq is productive because it shows the link between genocide in its various forms and nation-state or nation-building. We maintain that Assyrian experiences of genocide in both Iraq and Turkey cannot be analyzed without situating them in the context of the international arena and the formation of the modern nation-state system. Specifically, this formation of the modern nation-states of Turkey and Iraq were constructed in opposition to Western powers and influence. So, in order to consolidate their newly created states, they needed to establish the identity of each nation within a bounded territory. In the case of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire was a multinational entity, which was then transformed into a territorially bounded sovereign nation-state. This transition manifested itself through genocide to construct an exclusively Turkish national state. Similarly, Iraq was constructed out of 3 Ottoman vilayets and brought together previously autonomous peoples under one nation-state. So herein lay the tension. Both the Turkish and Iraqi states had to homogenize their multinational societies in order to create a nation-state. The advent of nationalism in the 19th century, stirred up by the process of westernization, meant exclusion became a prime factor underlying the creation of Turkish national nation-state. That is, in part, the ideology of Turkism gave justification to violent means to transform a heterogeneous empire into a homogeneous state based on the concept of one nation, one people. In the case of Iraq, perceptions of Assyrians as migrants from Turkey, as discussed earlier by Dr. Nicholas El-Jioun, and the enlisting of Assyrians in the levies were some of the factors contributing to their exclusion from the Iraqi state. However, as Mariam discussed, they were just traveling within their traditional territories. They did not see it as different states. Assyrian resistance of Arab nationalism with the development and propagation of their own nationalist ideas was another point of contention between the two parties. Arabs were suspicious of Assyrians because they refused to fall under Arab nationalism, which was seen as a solution to British foreign intervention. However, for Assyrians, the growing definition of Iraq along Arab cultural and ethnic lines exasperated their feelings of not belonging, inciting them to continue their call for autonomy. The culmination of these events was the massacre of Semele in August 1933. This first act of the newly independent Iraqi state is significant. The formation of Iraq demonstrates the violence that is associated with building a nation based on one dominant collective identity. This tension between the state and its inability to accommodate Assyrians would continue throughout different periods under different regimes in Iraq's history. As we've been discussing throughout this conference, there are different periods of violence that have been continuous for the Assyrian population. The 2003 invasion and subsequent regime change in Iraq has not resulted in discontinuation of these policies. Rather, this period has been characterized by the continuation of marginalization, both politically and economically, but also in certain areas, their direct expulsion from their lands. In this presentation, we focus on the political structure of Iraq by looking at the Constitution. The Constitution of the state is crucial. It has a significant role in structuring the political system of the state as it outlines the responsibilities of the government to its citizens, along with their rights and liberties, while simultaneously identifying the people who represent the state. We analyzed the 2005 Iraqi Constitution to highlight the political implications of the preamble in Article 3. The Constitution has a significant role, the Constitution has a significant role in identifying the dominant collective of the state. Article 3 does this by clearly indicating, and I quote, Iraq is a country of multiple nationalities, religions, and sects. It is a founding and active member in the Arab League, and it is committed to its charter, and it is part of the Islamic world, end quote. This article is significant as it recognizes that there are multiple nationalities within the state. However, within the Constitution, the contribution of Assyrians to Iraq is erased. For instance, in the preamble, it recognizes the atrocity and tragedies of Iraq's past by its martyrs, which we've been discussing here so much. And the Constitution states the Shia and Sunni, Arabs and Kurds and Turkmen, and from all other components of the people. Here, we are relegated to a component instead of being named like the other groups. This is extremely disheartening when taking into account the dispossession and atrocities committed against Assyrians during the Semele massacre of 1933 and the Anfal campaign in order to nationalize them as Iraqi through Arabization policies and practices. This shows the exclusion of Assyrians in terms of Iraq's historical memory. And as we've been discussing, the historiography of a nation and a state is really important. So by just discussing as a component, you're erasing an important contribution of Assyrians to the history of Iraq. Moreover, the preamble of the Constitution begins with, we, the people of Mesopotamia, and goes on to claim the achievements of ancient Mesopotamians as Iraqi. This is not new. Since the creation of the Iraqi state, successive Arab regimes have attempted to construct an Iraq through the appropriation of Mesopotamian culture and history to construct a prestigious Iraq. Even more problematically, this dilutes the Assyrian claim to an ancient Mesopotamian heritage. In this way, the Constitution is one instance of violence in Iraq's attempts to achieve its nationalistic goal. Collectively, these crimes against the Assyrian minority illustrate the implications of nationalism, both in Iraq and Turkey. The globalization of the Westphalian state system ushered in a new world where states were territorial enclosures of one nation. This effectively meant the exclusion and often expulsion of those deemed as not belonging to the national body. Much of the conversation about Seyfo has focused on religious factors, namely Muslim-Christian relations. However, we argue that the political atmosphere also shapes relations. Following World War I, we see the creation of national states, which oftentimes required and even encouraged the removal of indigenous populations. In this way, analyzing Seyfo, Semele, and post-2003 violence against Assyrians as nation-building exercises by the Turkish and Iraqi states allows us to situate this violence within the larger international context. This violence in constructing Turkey and Iraq is not unique. The modern nation-building project has resulted in such violence and dispossession of indigenous people all over in the making of homogeneous states. This conclusion is politically salient because we situate Assyrians as indigenous and link their experiences to other indigenous peoples. We are able to access perhaps more fruitful avenues in achieving a future for Assyrians which allows us to achieve more fruitful avenues in achieving a future for Assyrians in their homelands. Moreover, identifying as an indigenous minority as opposed to simply a religious minority can also be politically useful because indigenous rights include the right to land, to self-govern, the preservation of language and culture through social and state institutions. We look forward to your questions. Thank you.
The floor is open to question.
My comment is to Riva, the last speaker. You correctly cited from the preamble, I think, of the Iraqi constitution, right?
Yes.
And saying that Assyrians are not mentioned just as a component. I would make things more worse. You should read the first paragraph, which really is cynical, and I may read it. We are the people of the land between the two rivers, the homeland of the apostles and prophets, and virtuous and so weiter, pioneers of civilization, crafters of writing and cradle of numeration. Upon our land, the first law was made by man and passed, and most ancient and so weiter policy was instructed. So, but further down, it says everything will be based on Sharia. So this is the cynical, and Assyrians has established the writing and the legal system back 5,000 years ago are not mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up because that is also mentioned in the Constitution, as you say. And when you read all that, those are all the accomplishments of the Assyrian people, so Assyrian ancestry and ancient Mesopotamia. So it does conclude with the Mesopotamian. So.
There was a second question. Was another question in that area as well? Or that was you? Okay, go ahead.
Actually, we'd like to about Malik Yaqub Malik Ismail. The question was why Tehran? Because at the time, that was the only printing press available in Middle East that printed Assyrian, and in Iraq they wouldn't have allowed it. About the military, about the massacre.
So he had the contacts with Iran to make it possible to...
At the time, Assyrian Youth Cultural Society of Tehran had contact with all Assyrians all over the world. So that's how it came about. Secondly, Malik Yaqub correctly identified all the wars, which I have to sum. I'm not of any kind of scholar or anything, but I have followed his wars carefully, all that he mentioned. And most of the wars, they were victorious. However, end game, you can win a war and lose a battle. They lost the battle. If you read Dr. Vigram, our smallest ally, in his book, he has mentioned the victory of Assyrians, which a few hundred, they beat third Turkish corps to the Pole. They didn't left anything. Of course, they shot all the Germans because of the fact that they didn't understand why the Christians would have Muslims to kill them. They shot the Germans and took Turks as a captive. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't need to say...
Yeah, was information given. Would you like to respond?
Just thank you, and I'd like to hear a bit more about the Youth Federation in the break.
Sure.
Great.
Sure.
Then there was a question in the back.
Just 3 points for Elaine. You were wondering about the maps, and I've been looking at that book since I was an early teenager. So I've been also looking at the maps and trying to figure out where they're from. And I realized that one of them, the big one, not the one of Haikali, is actually a translation, I think, of an English map from Stafford.
I've seen that.
Tragedy of the Assyrians. And you also asked whether or not the Assyrians of Hakkari or Urbi knew what was happening elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. I'm not sure if the people that stayed in the Middle East knew, but definitely the ones that published books outside in the diaspora between 1916 and 1920 did know. For example, Abraham Yohanan in Death of a Nation does mention the massacres in Botan, and even though he was from Urmia, he mentions the massacres in Botan and around Midyat. And Joseph Naim, obviously, in Childish Nation Die, and the French version of the same book mentions the wife of
Oh, thank you.
Now, I was just going to say it's very interesting that you mentioned this whole psyche of Malik Yahu, of only wanting to recount the victories.
No, I didn't say that, but
Well,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
between the lines, he sort of said that he wanted to write about the victories more than the losses. Well, he does write more about the battles. My grandfather in Melbourne published a book in 1996 called The Assyrian, the Rod of My Anger. Now, he wrote it under a pen name, Eva Haddad, which is my aunt's name, but he did write it mostly about the battles that were fought during the genocide period. And I remember, because I was about 13 or 14 at the time, I told him, "Granddad, why are you only writing about the wars that we won? There were plenty of massacres during that time. Our people got decimated." He said, "Son, I don't want people to read this book to think that Assyrians are wimps." He said, "I want people to remember when we won the battles. Maybe we didn't necessarily win the war, but I want people to remember our victories." And it's very sort of interesting that there's a little bit of a parallel there.
Great, thank you. Response?
Yeah, there's not much to add. Thank you. Stafford, it's all on my desk at home, and I was starting to compare it, so that's what I'll look into more closely. What I am looking for is not so much, so immediately after the war, I think, yes, you see this knowledge of what is happening, trickling through to the various communities over the world, and then also in the Middle East. So I'm just wondering if anyone comes across things in 1915. So maybe 1916 is the first that Assyrians from Hakkari or from Urmi write about Turabin and vice versa. That I would be, if anyone comes across that, I would be interested to hear about it. They must have known something, but what exactly, I don't know, and I would be interested to hear that. So, but thanks, this helps. Yeah.
Great. Another question over here.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for your talks. I have a question for Miriam and Riva. I mean, as you probably know, I'm interested in identity and identity theory. And in your talk, you said that location, place is important because to form or maybe even recover an identity, you have to identify yourself with a place or a location. Although I know this is a kind of sensitive issue, I still will want to address it. Is that still the case? Because, I mean, let's give a very brief example. I mean, I have been traveling, I think, the last couple of months. I was in Rome, and now I'm in Berlin, and next week I will be in China, and a couple of weeks later I will be in the US. So we are living in a kind of a global village, in a global world. So the world has become a village. And at the same time, I mean, I'm talking to you now, and I was listening to you, I was emailing and SMSing with my colleagues at university, still tackling some issues. So is location, place still an important aspect or dimension for identity and identity formation, especially maybe because this might be also relevant for the Assyrian issue?
I think thank you for your question, because I found your talk really interesting as well. So I think identity is comprised of so many different things. I don't think it rests on space alone. But that doesn't mean that space doesn't matter. I think that especially when it comes to indigenous populations, They find the attachment to the land an integral part of their identity. I left Iraq in 1994. My father's from the north of Iraq, and the first thing I remember my father ever telling me when I asked where we're from, because I was born in Baghdad, but my parents were from different places, my dad would tell me, we come from ancient Syrians. They try to wipe us out a bunch of times at different times, but we're still here. And he always used to tell me, remember, if there's one thing you remember, you're from Bimendul Muhtalla, which is the place where he's from. He calls it occupied, right? So I mean, yes. And if you look at indigenous populations in Canada, which I do a lot of comparative analysis there, definitely there's a connection to the land. Is it the only connection that matters for identity? Absolutely not. And especially when you look at the practices of colonialism, whether it's European or otherwise, the renaming of spaces is a very fundamental practice to this. There's also kind of a lot of writers have talked about it as a sort of violence committed against peoples because they no longer are familiar with the place that they're from, where they recognize themselves. So I mean, if you even look at now out of it, calling it howler, right, or however you. Sorry, I might have pronounced that wrong. So. Yes, renaming of spaces, even Canada, a lot of indigenous populations call it Turtle Island still. Right? I go to the University of Alberta, which is on unceded Papachase Cree territory. So I think these people, and if you talk to these indigenous populations, they will tell you similar things. I hope that answers your question.
Next question, the lady here.
I'd like to revert back to the very first question that was raised and develop the concept of tribalism. I lived in Iraq for very extensive periods from 1987 to 2002, and whilst there was an Iraqi identity, when you scratched the surface, the main identity of people was the tribe to which they belonged, which could include Christians. This was told to me on a number of occasions. So we are hearing a lot about tribes, particularly in the Hakkari, where people were organised into tribes. But the Christian communities, as you would know very well, is much more complex. How do we fit the urban populations of Mosul, northern Iraq, etc., who really didn't have a tribal identity? So it's I think, a distortion just to deal with sort of a tribal mentality, although it's very important in Iraq, but that's where the Christians were without, and they had to seek the protection of Sunni tribes to help them. I wondered if any of you would like to comment on the dimension of tribalism.
Actually, I know people in this room have done work on the 50s and 60s in Iraq, so they may know better. But from my, when I think about these issues, and when I see the documents even from 1933, the Syriac Orthodox and Syriac Catholic patriarchs in Mosul wrote a letter in a newspaper claiming that the Syrians participating in the Samel massacre are rebellions and they have nothing to do with them, or the populations that they administer or they take care of. It becomes very clear also later on when these populations become involved in communist and Arab nationalist activities that they are really seeking to attach themselves to political ideas that eliminate this tribal identity and become superimposed with ideas of I guess, political ideas that replace tribes with something else in order to be able to live in the state that is being created by the British and after by the new Republic of Iraq with something that they can belong to, that they can become members of. And I know Elda's done work on this issue. I'm not sure what she has to say about this, but it seems to me that the urban populations were less interested in this tribal ideas and more interested.
Identify with the tribal.
Yeah, but I mean Christian peoples of Mosul, for example, they don't really identify with tribes. I mean Christians of Mosul, and later on when they lived in Baghdad after the Shawaf movement, they really had no ideas about tribes. What they really identified with is the city of Mosul. And this urban attachment to Mosul is quite startling at times. I mean, if you talk to somebody from Mosul and you say, where are you from? The first thing that they will tell you is from Mosul. They will never even tell you I'm from Iraq. They will. It's Mosul is this, you know, holy grail. Even, and I mean, you speak Maslawi, yeah. I mean, and it's very proud that you speak Maslawi, and you're very proud of your Maslawi food, and you're very proud of your Maslawi Muslim neighbors even, because they're Maslawi, and you would deal with a Maslawi Muslim neighbor over dealing with somebody who's a tribal Assyrian from one of the villages north of Mosul. It's a very strong idea about the space and the urban space. So when we talk about tribalism in Iraq, we have to really be careful not to mix everybody in this tribal idea, because those who actually lived in urban centers, be it Baghdad, Basra, or Mosul, they were very much urbanites, and they were very much in love with this whole idea of urbanism and urban spaces. And actually, if you read, you know, works that are coming out, recent edited collection on urbanscapes in Iraq, Kirkuk is another very important space, especially with the arrival of the British and the British Petroleum Company. So we really can't mix everybody in this urban, rural divide about tribalism in Iraq, this, you know, tribal place. Even be Christian, Muslim populations, if you were an urbanite, you were an urbanite, particularly if you joined the communist movement or Arab nationalist movements. You really had this desire to change the idea and overthrow these traditional concepts with something modern, something that changes from tribal to urban. At least this is...
I would also contextualize what you just said too, because space matters. Like, so you were talking about the Christians in Mosul. A lot of these Christians in Mosul have ancestry that is Assyrian. My mother is from Mosul, and she's a Syroyo from Turkey originally, right? So, but because of all these Arabization policies, yes, of course they don't have as much ties with what you were calling tribal Assyrians, but I think that also needs to be contextualized in terms of not just space, but colonial and assimilation policies as well.
Well, that's what I was trying to point out, that it's a much more complex...
It is.
Yes.
It is. It's not as simple as easy as we say tribes versus non-tribes. Yeah, I mean...
Great. Our next question?
So, anyway, so just maybe a useful concept. Iraqi example actually is a failed nation-state building project. So that's right. So can we speak about an Iraqi identity? So just most of the people, I think they will say no. So just anyway, that's not my expertise area, but it's a failed nation-state project. So I can say another just contribution. Let's put it in this way: the territory, the role of territory in identity formation processes. I think Anthony Smith's concept or the approach, his approach, not the possession of territory, but the perception or your mythical relation with that territory is important. So if you put it in that way, your perception of that territory, your link, would help a lot. So to understand the link. So. The third question goes, I think, to Helen and Fadi. I think I wonder what has been the contribution of this military leadership in the Assyrian leadership profile. So we usually know that Assyrians, they have religious leadership, established religious leadership profiles. These attempts, first in just the Yaquba Ismail, and then also in the experimental place Bakuba refugee camp.
Can you come to the end of your question?
Yeah. I think I talk quite just very short.
Yeah, good. I'm not quite sure. So if we talk about Yaku, I think Malik Yaku was so close to the Patriarchate that for me, as not having seen all the sources, it's very difficult to make out what is kind of the military interest of Malik Yaku, and what is the Tiari interest, and what is the patriarchal church interest. So it's all together so I find it difficult to distinguish there really kind of the military leadership from the state in his case. But what you see, of course, is the discussion with the other parties, which are influenced and inspired by other types of military and political and strategic ideas. So in that sense, you can see that the military leadership is one of the aspects, but I don't think it's the only aspect of the rift between the various parties. The other thing is the urban-rural connection. So there's all kinds of things, the connections with the various Western parties that make for these different groups among the Assyrians. So the military aspect is only just one of that. It's not the only thing that makes for division between the Assyrians, but it's part of it.
Actually, just to plug my work, I worked a lot on this warriorization and militarization, and what I see is that it's a really Agapotros and his people. They created the Nationalist Assyrian Committee, I think that's what they call it, in the refugee camp, and later on continues to operate. And what they really do is they try to challenge and overthrow the religious establishment for a military establishment, and they say we are the legitimate leaders of this population and we speak for them. And they even had proposals, later on with Hormuz Rassam and others, with the Syrian Nationalist Committee that goes to the League of Nations and decides to speak for the Syrian population in the 1928 to 1933 period. They say we are going to speak for the minorities in the Middle East, in Iraq particularly. We are going to speak for the Syrians and the Yazidis because we lead this entire population. The religious leaders should keep their mouth shut and know where their place is. And this is actually literally what he says in the letter that he sends to the League of Nations. And he says, Surma Shamoun is my personal enemy, and she's trying to besmirch my name and my honor. So it's a very interesting divide, which we can talk about later, but it's very key to our understanding of Syrians.
Mm-hmm. I think we have much run over the time. I'm very sorry, but maybe you can follow up your question in the break. And I thank you all for listening, and thank you for your contributions.